Behind me is Charles Fort, which defends the port of Kinsale in Ireland. Really charming town in the southwest part of that country. I visited it in the spring of 2011 during a really memorable vacation in County Cork and then in Dublin, which of course is Ireland's capital city. The fort is named for England's King Charles II. It is a classic Tracitalien fortification, a bastion fort, with one section of the outer wall built in a star fashion. It replaced an earlier fort, also based on the Tracitalien, which is now in ruins. The fort is located on the water's edge at the southern end of the village of Summer Cove, just outside of Kinsale, and conveniently located near an upscale pub. The fort was begun in 1677 and completed in 1682. It is now operated as a heritage tourism site by the Republic of Ireland. It had one obvious weakness that I noticed as soon as I reached the fort, and which puzzled me a good deal. Its defenses were focused entirely against a sea attack, and despite the standard bastion trace on the landward side, ostensibly to ward off a land attack, it is overlooked by higher ground. This defect helped the English capture the fort when it was besieged for 13 days during an Anglo-Irish war in 1690. But notwithstanding the weakness of Charles Fort in this respect, it is a classic example of the Tracitalien fort, or the artillery fortress, which you begin to see in Europe in the latter part of the 15th century, and then it becomes dominant, not just in Europe, but eventually the world over, because of the tremendous advantage it had over medieval type fortresses in terms of stopping attacks by armies utilizing cannons and associated types of equipment. What I want to do now is I want to put up the screen, of course. Give me a moment to do that. Here we go. Here are the terms for the military revolution. The artillery fortress, this Tracitalien, is the second of the two terms, and you're going to see it over and over again during the course of this presentation. By the end of this presentation, you should understand, first, the concept of the military revolution and the idea that history proceeds by scholarly dialogue. Next, how gunpowder led to the demise of the medieval castle. Third, to know in detail the artillery fortress and the Tracitalien, how it was constructed, why it was constructed the way that it was, how it operated, and so on. Next, a phenomenon called the infantry revival. Then a concept called the tax of violence. Next, the Westphalian settlement, which occurs in 1648, but which we still are dealing with today, because it's this Westphalian settlement that in effect created the modern nation state system with which we are most familiar. And then finally, the rise of professional armies in Europe. Now, between 1470 and 1710, the size of European armies increased dramatically. The size of French armies increased the most, from 40,000 to 400,000. If you look at the column with France, you'll see that. But all European armies showed a similar increase. Well, what accounts for this increase? And what was its larger impact on the European state? Those are the main questions we're going to consider in this presentation. The greater size of armies meant that once again, infantry came to replace cavalry as the preeminent military branch. Infantry was much cheaper to field than cavalry, be it recalled. Infantry and cavalry were joined by a new weapon, artillery, or cannon. Now, before I go on, I want to talk about how history advances by debate. This is Michael Roberts, 1908, 1996. He was the first to come up with the idea of a military revolution concept. And here is the essay that he wrote in the 1950s advancing this particular concept of a military revolution. This was answered by a student of his, who was, by the way, is a professor at Ohio State University to this very day, Jeffrey Parker. And in 1988, Jeffrey Parker published a whole book on this military revolution, subtitled Military Innovation and the Rise of the West, 1500 to 1800. And so this book of Jeffrey Parker's is also very much in effect, the Hansen mold of talking about a Western way of war that by its superiority over the ways of war practiced in other civilizations enabled Europeans to dominate most of the world's surface by 1914. So that's one thing that Hansen and Jeffrey Parker have in common. History advances by debate. So you have Michael Roberts with his idea of the military revolution, then Jeffrey Parker with his. Then you have a fellow named Jeremy Black, who's a near contemporary of Jeffrey Parker's, who wrote a book questioning this military revolution called A Military Revolution, Military Change in European Society, 1550 to 1800. And overall, this military revolution debate spawned enough in the way of literature that one of the contributors to this military revolution debate, a friend of mine, Clifford Rogers, there shown carving up a turkey, best picture I could find of him in a casual pose. Cliff ended up not only contributing articles and so on dealing with the military revolution, but also edited a volume of readings on this military revolution debate. So it's not as though historians start off with a set of facts and come up with a common interpretation or understanding of what these facts mean. They argue. They engage in dialogue for the most part, civil dialogue, and it is this process of debate that advances history. So that when you hear people talk as if history is static, as if history is unchanging, as if the kind of history that a person learned in their own childhood is the way that history should always be taught, that's a fundamental error. That assumes that history should be static. In fact, it isn't, it never has been, it never will be. History evolves. It proceeds by discussion, it proceeds by debate, it proceeds by asking new questions, uncovering new evidence, and so on. And it doesn't end there. We have additional books that have come out on the military revolution as well. I had my daughter stand in as sort of a prop to show you two additional books on the military revolution, and additional works on this subject come out now every few years. The Michael Roberts, the original military revolution thesis going back to 1955, is based upon a revolution in tactics, an infantry revival, which made possible those larger armies. That's a huge data point that everybody agrees upon. You have this sudden explosive growth in the size of armies over a period of a few decades. So you have these larger armies, and they allowed for more ambitious and complex strategies, which in turn created changes in war that increased their intensity and cost, and it generated administrative burdens. That's why he calls it a military revolution. Jeffrey Parker came up with a revised military revolution thesis, which he has continued to refine, by the way. His book, The Military Revolution, came out in 1988, but it's gone through a second edition and is now being revised into a third. I'll give you a portion of his thesis. We're not going to do the whole thing because really it's a little bit too elaborate, but what he argues is that you have a series of innovations in the nature of warfare on land and sea in Western Europe between 1430 and 1630 that combined to create a new way of war. The combined impact of these innovations far exceeded the sum of the parts. They interacted with and responded to outside stimuli, socially, politically, and in terms of economic growth, intellectual evolution, and environmental change. But at the heart of this military revolution, from a technological standpoint, as Geoffrey Parker understands it, is not the revival in infantry tactics. That's not the point of departure for it. It is rather cannon. Gunpowder, of course, you need to have gunpowder if you're going to have cannons. Gunpowder originated in China, but as an agent of warfare, it was used mainly by the Ottoman Empire and by Europe. Its basic component was saltpeter, combined with smaller portions of sulfur and charcoal. The explosive ignition of gunpowder releases gases that expand over 1,000 times the space of the original mixed product. The military application of such force, this tremendous expansion from a small amount of solid fuel to a huge amount of gaseous combustion. The military application of this kind of force was obvious, but it took hundreds of years for ordnance specialists to perfect both the gunpowder and, more particularly, the means needed to deliver it. The first cannon appeared as early as 1325 and were used on a minor scale during the Hundred Years' War, but they were heavy and clumsy and hard to use except in static situations like sieges. Practical field artillery, which is to say the kinds of cannon that you could move around on a battlefield, came much later. But these earlier cannon could be used aboard large vessels, and as we've seen, were one of the major factors that allowed European forces to expand into other parts of the world. By the end of the 15th century, that is to say the 1400s, cannon had grown in size and reliability and became very effective at toppling medieval castles. Even a castle such as this one, Crac de Chevalier, in present-day Syria, which was considered one of the best medieval castles. It was put there by the Crusaders. Even this even this castle would have been vulnerable to cannon fire. The reason? Its high stone walls could be gradually crushed to rubble by heavy cannonballs. Furthermore, medieval castles were designed to resist close-up infantry attack. Cannon, however, could stand off at a distance and take advantage of dead ground, which is to say areas that were lower ground from which the defenders could not fire back effectively. By the early 1500s, this led to the rise of the artillery fortress, a fortress specifically designed to use artillery and to defend against artillery. And we're looking at such a fortress, a diagram, looking sort of directly downward at it so that you can see the design of this artillery fortress. This distinctive design was called the Trace Italienne, or the Italian trace, because it was used early on and extensively in Italy. Another name for the distinctive design was the bastion trace. For each star-shaped point in the fortress was a bastion that contained both artillery and infantry. Each bastion was constructed of low-lying, brick-faced earthen ramparts. Low-lying to reduce the area that could be struck by an enemy cannonball. And by the way, of course, now you're looking at the profile. You're looking at it sideways on rather than upward down. So you're talking about a low-lying profile to reduce the area that could be struck by an enemy cannonball. Brick-faced, in large measure to provide a good containment for the mounds of earth that did the main work of blocking the cannonball. The mounds absorbed the energy of the cannonball. They were also very thick at the base. These profiles were also very thick at the base, which made them difficult to undermine effectively. In other words, to dig tunnels underneath them and place gunpowder bombs or something like that that would destroy the walls of the fortress. And by the way, if a mine did happen to go off, the earth could usually absorb that as well. Both cannon and the artillery fortress were very expensive to build and maintain. Only the wealthiest cities and monarchs could afford them. They are one of the reasons that monarchs were able to reassert practical control over their kingdoms during the 1400s and 1500s and became much more powerful than lesser dukes, barons, and so on. In a sense, they sounded the death knell of the feudal system. Historians still debate the exact nature of this military revolution. Some even reject the term. But the combination of gunpowder weapons, artillery fortresses, and large infantry armies clearly had a major effect on the rise of the new monarchies of early modern Europe. Early modern Europe, by the way, is conveniently dated as going from 1450 to 1750, or to be exact, 1789, for reasons we'll get into a bit later on. Here is the fortress city of Palma Nova, constructed by Venetians, the citizens of Venice, in what is today the northeast frontier of Italy. And it was Palma Nova was created to defend against incursions by the Ottoman Turks. It's a planned city with the Transitalienne in mind the entire time. Founded in 1593, it took 30 years to construct the first circle of fortifications, about 4 miles in circumference. Thereafter, it expanded twice, 1658 to 1690 by Venice, and then 1806 to 1813, while under the domination of Napoleon Bonaparte. A key aspect of the Transitalienne is that it required financial resources far beyond the reach of medieval lords. Only city-states or kingdoms could afford them. And again, to repeat a point, this helped transfer political power away from the great lords and back to the monarchs. An important step in the creation of the so-called new monarchies that brought the feudal era to a close. The lords remained as European nobility. There are nobility in Europe down to this very day, but they are completely subordinate to the monarchs by the end of this period. Here is the original moat of Palma Nova. And you can see that this is that if infantry had attempted to attack, they would have had to come over the left-hand side into this moat area, which could have been filled with water and so forth. Then they would have had a high wall to climb, although from a distance, this seemingly high wall would have been almost completely out of sight relative to the cannon that would have to fire upon it. So we're dealing with with something that's geometrically and architecturally really very sophisticated. The Transitalienne fortress system came to dominate Europe and also overseas. This is a present-day view of Castillo San Felipe del Morro, El Morro as it's called, which guards the harbor entrance to San Juan, Puerto Rico. Construction began in 1589 and took several years. It superseded previous fortifications built on the same spot. San Juan itself, by the way, was founded in 1521. This view of the glacis of El Morro shows its reduced profile on the land side. And what I mean by the glacis is what they would do is they would level off the land, and you can see how it angles down. But this isn't natural. This was done deliberately. This gentle angling downward, And the idea is that attackers would have to first of all go uphill. They try to attack head on, and this entire field would be this entire area would be covered by cannon fire. Cannon could hit any part of it. There's no dead ground to speak of, and because any enemy cannon would have to be at the lower end of the glacis, it wouldn't have very much of the wall of El Morro visible for it to shoot at. Here again, in Fort Jesus, the Portuguese stronghold that guarded the crucial port of Mombasa on the Indian coast in present-day Kenya. Again, you're looking here at more evidence of the impact of the Trace-Italienne design. And it goes on from there. Here is Fort McHenry of Star Spangled Banner fame in Baltimore, Ohio. The fort was constructed between 1798 and 1800. And here again, you see the classic Trace-Italienne design. It's smaller. It's a fort that's guarding Baltimore Harbor rather than a string of fortifications surrounding the harbor. But you'll notice the bastion trace, the moats surrounding the fortress. If you were to look straight on at the end, you would see that the walls of Fort McHenry would only be just a little bit above the profile of the fort as you could see it. That is a classic Trace-Italienne fortress. Okay. So you begin to see these. So by the late 1800s, the late 1700s, the early 1800s, you see this style of fortification all over the world.